So, good morning, everyone, and welcome to PDM's next forum on housing issues. I'm Peter Enrich, PDM chair, and I'm going to be facilitating today's session. And let me just start off with a couple of logistical things. As you just saw, we are recording this session, and we'll be making the tape of it available shortly after. We ask people not to use the chat for side conversations. We found that tends to be distracting, and we'd prefer to keep the focus on the discussion in front of us. We've got a very, very full agenda, and we'll probably not have an opportunity to open it up to questions from the floor. But if you do have a question or need a piece of further information, do feel free to share that in the chat, and we will try and address it. This is the second of a series of forums that Progressive Dems is going to be doing on the housing issue. As many of you know, we've been doing more or less monthly forums for several years now on a variety of topics that need attention. Housing is an issue that is more complex and more critical than anything else in front of the Commonwealth right now. And so we felt that the only way to give it fair treatment was to do a series of discussions about the different aspects of it. And so this is the second in the series. The first one was an attempt to do a general overview, and that is taped, and we encourage people who weren't here for that to take a look at it. And what came out of that session was that at the heart of the problem is that there simply is not enough housing in Massachusetts. There's a shortfall of several 100,000 units of housing. And until and unless we can address that, we are going to continue to be in a state of crisis. The next two forums after this one are going to address the issues of how do we expand the housing stock. And we're going to address in the next forum, which will be in late October, we're going to address issues of how do you pay for getting housing built in a world where the cost of building housing is greater than what many people can afford to pay for that housing. And then the other piece of that discussion will be a forum on regulatory issues and what the constraints are from zoning and other regulatory obstacles, how regulation can be used to clear a path for more housing to be built. But adding housing to our stock is not going to happen overnight. It's going to take years at best. And so the focus for today's forum is, what do we do in the meanwhile? What is happening on the ground because of the undersupply of housing? How is it impacting families? What can we be doing to keep people housed and to make housing workable in the near term? We have a wonderful panel to discuss this with us. Let me just briefly introduce the three of them, and then we will dive in. So first is Kim Borden, who is the director of the very highly regarded Tenancy Preservation Program in Western Massachusetts as part of the Berkshire County Regional Housing Authority. She's had more than 30 years experience working in this field, has been at the Berkshire County Regional Housing Authority for almost 2 decades, and is familiar with and expert on the challenges in that part of the state. Second, we've got Denise Matthew-Turner, who is the co-executive director of City Life Vida Urbana. which has long been a leading organization in the Boston metro area, working on housing issues and on a wide range of racial, social, economic justice, gender equity issues, working against displacement, building community power. Denise has been part of the executive staff at City Life for a number of years, and as I said, is now the co-executive director. Third, we have Mark Martinez. Mark is presently staff attorney in the housing unit at Mass Law Reform Institute, which, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is the statewide backup for legal services, does wonderful policy and strategic litigation work. Mark, before that, was on the staff of State Senator Patricia Jalen, where he was legal counsel and budget director. Before that, he was one of my students at Northeastern University School of Law, and it's wonderful to have him join us for this. So we've got three people who just are deeply embedded in these issues, and I hope can shed some real light. So I think probably the place to start is just to talk a little bit about what the situation is on the ground now and how the undersupply of housing is impacting the communities in which you work. And Denise, would you start that off and talk about the impact in your communities?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Thank you for having me. And also it's good to be here with Mark and Kim. As Peter mentioned, you know, City Life is a grassroots organization. We've been organizing in the Metro Boston area since 1973. And, you know, Peter mentioned that, you know, our mission, you know, we're a social racial justice organization, and nowhere in our mission is housing mentioned, but it's been the through line for our organization and its organizing since 1973. I think it's important to say that we're organizers in our organization. So our orientation is to sort of harness the people most impacted. So we feel that makes, you know, that's crucial. So I think I'll start off by characterizing our community and the challenges as unstable, you know, the lack of stability, because as you know, and it's worth mentioning, stable housing, it's fundamental to family health, economic mobility, educational attainment, and community integration. Our new development is not meeting the needs at the moment, so, and rental listings in Boston are, the average is around, for one bedroom was something like $2,600. And so our members, who are predominantly people of color, majority women, and concentrated in communities that are just really ripe for speculation. The other thing it's obvious, we said there's lack of rent regulation. So for our tenants who are facing massive increases, rent increases, and without matching income increases. So that's what we're seeing. And I guess I would characterize also the resistance, though, there to what people are facing is what is part of the solution that we use. So before going into, I do want to say a little bit about how we organize. we use a strategy that we call the sword, the shield, and the offer. And it's really important. It's a three-prong approach to tackling the issue. The sword is our organizing. I mean, we think that making the issue public is one of is instrumental in our strategy. Our members, they are encouraged to write to their representatives, to actually write and engage with the landlord. But coupled with that is the shield, which is the legal, administrative, and legislative tools that we bring to bear. Um, our um, our work is crucial because we partner with the Harvard Legal Aid Bureau, Greater Boston Legal Services, and the Legal Service Center of Harvard Law School. Weekly, law students and lawyers from our key partners are at our weekly member meetings, providing advice and also strategizing with our organizers and the tenant to fight their case. We aim to collectivize when we can, also the individual fights. Ultimately, our aim is to get land out of the speculative market. So our strategy, our organizing combined with the legal pressure that we bring to bear, ultimately, we have been able to negotiate 3, 5 long-term contracts where the tenants have some sense of stability, at least for 3 to 5 years. And we negotiate those contracts at a price that the tenants can afford. When we have also been able to negotiate for the landlord to sell the property to a CDC or to a land trust. That then makes for permanent affordability. That is our ultimate goal. So, and there will be cases I can tell you where we've done that in Mattapan, in Dorchester, and in East Boston. But we organize in Boston, north of Boston, in Medford, Everett, Malden, and then also our work has expanded southeast to Brockton, as far as south as Brockton. But we also organize in coalition with other community groups. The Housing Fight City Life knows that we're not going to do it alone. So we organize statewide with the Homes for All coalition. And and on a local level, we organize with Right to the City of Boston.
Okay.
Our efforts on the state level, most recently through the Homes for All coalition, has been the filing of 2 pieces of legislation. That is the focus of our work right now. There's a rent control legislation that was filed in January, and also a foreclosure mediation bill.
We'll turn to those in a few minutes. Yeah,
I'm going to stop there, and yeah.
So yeah, so thank you. That gives a sense of what's happening in the Boston area. Of course, this is not a local problem limited to the Boston metro area. Kim, tell us a little bit about what the situation looks like on the ground out in the Berkshires.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for asking me. I appreciate being here. In the Berkshires, as is, and as you said, Peter, I would say nationwide, definitely statewide, there's a housing crisis. There's a shortage of affordable housing. So we're seeing folks who are, desperately searching for housing that they, as I said, could afford, and it's very difficult to find. At Berkshire County Regional Housing Authority, we put the focus on prevention, which is it's paramount, because of course, if you can prevent someone from becoming homeless, if you can prevent someone from losing their housing, then you've created a better system. When we're looking at the search part of it, the things that we're running into, and I guess I'm going to go back a minute and talk about how we got here. Okay. I know everybody's tired of hearing about COVID, but the reality is COVID happened. There was an eviction moratorium that happened that put some landlords in financial difficulties. Mom and pop landlords, and by that I mean the smaller landlords who maybe have one building or maybe two buildings, but not a large amount of properties, were hurt in through that time. And what happened was bigger property management companies from out of the area and even out of the state came in and started buying up these properties. Then they started evicting folks under the guise of, we're going to rehab these apartments. Well, I don't know how well their rehab went, but I know their rents went sky high. So now we have twofold. We have folks who are being evicted and no place to go. And it's just cyclical because people are trying to find apartments. They're renting apartments that they can't afford. And that just keeps, it just keeps the cycle going. My program, Tenancy Preservation, works with folks who have disabilities and are at risk of being evicted, and the eviction can be related back to the disability. So our goal is to go in, do a comprehensive assessment, plug in comprehensive case management, really good case management to follow these folks through, so that once their housing is preserved, they can, just stay on track. I heard you, Denise, mention mortgages and foreclosures. We have a foreclosure prevention program, which has proved so beneficial to so many homeowners, because homeowners have been hurt financially too. We've been in a financial crisis, and so with this, if we can prevent them from losing their house in the first place, again, we prevent them from being homeless. What is needed? We definitely need more subsidies. We need more subsidized housing. That we're going to find more on, it's going to be on a state or federal level, mostly state level. But folks confuse the terms affordable housing and subsidized housing, because they're two completely different things. Subsidized housing, you pay 30 to 40% of your income for rent and utilities, which you can afford. Affordable housing is based more on reasonable rents, which we're not seeing right now. I know this is going to be coming up in your next forum, but something that I've given a lot of thought to and had a lot of conversation around is, we don't need to build housing. Okay, what we need to do is repurpose the housing that is sitting there in our cities and towns, because owners have walked away, they've been foreclosed on, for whatever reason. We have we have an overwhelming amount of housing that people have lost, maybe even to taxes. So if we can go in and maybe through a receivership, maybe through, city and state funding, we can go in and rehab these houses, which is a lot, less expensive than building new properties. We're in a better position to be able to assist folks.
Right. So both of you have talked about some of the extraordinary work that your two organizations are doing to address the crisis of rising rents, unavailable housing, evictions, foreclosures. I want to turn now and spend most of the rest of our time today to thinking about what are the policy tools that would make that work more effective and more successful. And I think the place to start is with one that Denise already has mentioned and that has been a very hot topic of discussion recently, which is what we used to call rent control and what now seems to be more commonly called rent stabilization. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the history of this, Massachusetts had many municipalities, and Massachusetts did have rent control in place 40 years ago. But by an initiative, statewide initiative in the 1990s, municipalities were forbidden from enacting rent stabilization or rent control. And the question that I think is now coming before us again is, should we reauthorize municipalities to engage in rent stabilization? So Mark, talk to us a little bit about what's happening in this area and what you see as the needs.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks again for letting me be here. So, I think before we dive into rent control, there's a couple of things that I think are important to know, right, in the context of the fact that, right, PDM is having multiple forums. As as a huge proponent of rent control, as someone that spends most of my day working on rent control, I think it's really important to know that rent control is not the silver bullet, right? Nothing that we're going to talk about here today, nothing that's going to be talked about in any forum anywhere is going to solve all of the problems that we have. And so what we hear a lot is people saying, oh, well, rent control is not going to do this, that, or the other thing. And it's probably not. It's not designed to, right? Rent control is designed to do a very specific thing, and that is keep people in their homes now and stop them from being priced out of their homes. And it does that a few ways, like Peter mentioned, the state tomorrow could pass a new budget and put all $53 billion of the state budget into building every possible affordable unit that we could possibly need. That's going to take decades. And as we all know, people are hurting now. People are getting pushed out of their homes now and will continue to be priced out of their home. And not just in Boston, right? All over Massachusetts, people are being priced out. And so rent control is, like I said, designed to fix that very one particular problem. And that is, they call rent increases. I call rent gouging, right? It's these outrageous rent hikes that it's impossible for people to keep up with anywhere in Massachusetts. And it's important to mention the other things that rent control is designed to do. When people hear rent control or rent stabilization, they just think of, right, putting a cap on how much you can raise your rent. And that's important. That's an important part of the policy. But the thing that I think doesn't get talked about enough is this companion piece of rent control that has to go along with rent control, known as just cause eviction protections. So Massachusetts has what's known as no-fault evictions. And so basically what that means, as long as you're not within the defined terms of your lease, your landlord can evict you for no reason. They do not have to have a reason to get you out of the house. And, I've fallen victim to no-fault evictions. Plenty of people that I know have, and it's this really important part that, what we've learned, with, Kim talking about the pandemic, what many of us knew pre-pandemic, but I think what has everyone else has hopefully realized since the pandemic, is that housing is health, right? You can't be healthy, you can't take care of your health if you don't have a home. And so in addition to not allowing people to be priced out of their homes simply for the profit of largely large developers and corporate owners, we also can't allow people to just be thrown out of their house just because, for no reason. And so, just cause eviction protections are a really important part of this puzzle. And it's important also to realize that, this is not, when we talk about rent stabilization, especially here in Massachusetts, these are not the policies that were even implemented in Massachusetts back in the 70s when rent control existed. This is different, right? This is not a thing that is ever going to deprive landlords of their ability to make money. It's just going to deprive them from maximizing every cent of profit that they can out of a piece of property. And so we think that that is, the really important thing. And I think maybe later we're going to get into dispelling some of the myths about rent control. I'll stop for now there. And then, happy to answer any other questions that you have, Peter.
Let me start out with what is surely the most common critique of rent control. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who, when I took Econ 101, rent control was the paradigm example of what goes wrong when government tries to regulate market transactions. And the argument, of course, was, gee, if you limit the return on investment below what the market demands, people won't produce housing, and they will allow what housing they have to deteriorate because they aren't extracting the market value of it. We have a crisis of not having enough housing stock. What about that argument that rent control is going to make that problem worse, not better, and is going to end up not helping anyone? And I know, Mark, do you want to respond first? But I'd love to hear from Denise and Kim on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I have a few responses to that. One, there is this myth that economists agree, right? Everyone likes to reference this decades old Stanford economics, right, report on rent control. And it's just not true, right? I don't think you will find any topic where all economists agree on anything. And two, right, and if you want proof of that, recently, I think within the last month, I think it was a couple hundred economists from all over the country sent a letter to the Biden administration supporting rent control. And there's plenty of economist studies backing rent control as a viable option. And it doesn't do these things that these really outdated reports have done. The other thing that I will say to a couple of those things, one, this idea that rent control is going to lead to poor conditions in housing. I invite you to go along, right, to look at some of the conditions that people are already living in. I don't want to speak for Denise, but I'm sure she could bring you to some of the places that some of her members live in where there is not rent control. People are extracting maximum profits and they're already living in deteriorating conditions. And so that's just not a thing that I buy. And then the last thing that I'll say, and then I'll hand it over to Denise because it seems like she definitely wants to say something, right? This idea that it disincentivizes new construction. I'll say two things. One, every single serious rent control or rent stabilization policy includes some type of new construction exemption, right? We are aware that we need to build more housing, and that is baked into every single serious rent control proposal. And the other thing that I will say is, back to my point that rent control is not designed to fix everything. The far larger impediment to building new housing is exclusionary zoning, right? It's restrictive zoning that happens all over the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And I don't want to speak for all supporters of rent control, but I can certainly speak for the ones that I work with and say that we are all on board with reforming zoning. We are all on board with making building, especially affordable housing, easier. So, again, rent control is designed to solve a specific problem within this larger housing crisis. Zoning isn't one of them, but we're all on board. If someone wants to pick the zoning fight, I'll be the first one in line.
And we will be turning to that in one of our next forums. So yes. Denise, do you want to pitch in on this?
Yeah, a couple of things. I do want to, the orientation of our organization is that, our assessment is the housing market is constructed to do exactly what it is doing. And so, when we see in Mattapan, what we see are investors, uh, with an outsized economic advantage, actually really now consolidating control of real estate. So what's in place is the ability to use financial tools, finance structures of businesses to just really consolidate control of land. My colleague, my co-executive director, and I'm not the econ person, but one of the things that we are seeking to do in our strategy is to actually be able to some degree, match the money. We can't match the money of real estate, but one of the things that we can do as far as policies are concerned, and we fought for, putting money into an acquisition fund at the city of Boston that would enable, when there's an opportunity for a CDC or nonprofit to purchase a property and get it out of the speculative market, we have to be able to finance that. I'm on the board of a land trust, and we were organizing, enabled us to force a landlord to sell his property to the land trust. Those 6 units, those households are going to, those units are permanently affordable. And what we're trying to do is stabilize communities. So one of the things, so when we are seeing an out-of-state investor come in and have the opportunity to purchase a 220 unit property where residents, for the most part, have been living there. Our members have been living there 30 years, many on fixed income. And also, this property happens to be approximate to transit that was fought for in that community. And now that makes that community so much more attractive for investment, and for those folks who want that comfort. And so we're in a pitch battle right now with that developer, and the conditions and those apartments are, yeah, let's take a tour, and and operate on a 35-year-old stove with one burner. And this landlord in this instance is seeking to raise rents $500 on on a 70-year-old woman on a fixed income. And yeah, so those are the kinds of it. And a mile away, we fought an investor who came in from California to purchase, again, a 200 plus development. We got out in front of it, and I have to give a nod to the city of Boston, because the city of Boston's Office of Housing actually gave us a little bit of a heads up that this property was going to transfer. We were there, we were able to organize and form a tenant association. And, as a result, the tenants were able to negotiate a 5-year contract with reasonable rate increases. And in this case, we're talking 3%. But that was 2 years ago. What's afforded to that investor, and I can't, confirm their legal structure, But what we are also seeing now is private equity and real estate investment trusts moving into the rental market. And that, you know, the force of that money, what it does is the model is, the pattern is escalating rents, reduced services. So that contract that we won just, you know, 3 years ago, our tenants now are back are saying, you know, the understanding that, you know, the landlord was going to invest in resident services. They've cut resident services this year a half. So because their claim is we, you know, our profits are at stake. So resident services are cut.
So I want to make sure there are a lot of other pieces of this puzzle that I want to make sure we get to, but one last thing on rent control. Can one of you just fill us in? What is the path forward to actually making this possible? And Mark, do you want to talk briefly about that?
Yeah, let me let me do this without getting myself in trouble here today. So right, the path forward is a couple of things. I think one, right, to bring it back to, you know, what Denise said in the organizing, right, it's building a statewide movement, right? It's building support all over the place. I think there is still this really outdated notion that rent prices are just a concern in Boston. And we know that that's not true, right? We know that it's true from the Cape to the Berkshires. You know, I live in Boston now. I was born and raised in Western Mass, right? There's this idea that Western Mass is like the affordable part of the state. And while that might have been true when I was growing up there 30 years ago, right, it's simply not the case anymore. And that message is still very pervasive. And so I think, first of all, it's that, you know, I think it's organizing, it's spreading the message. You know, the opposition messaging on this has been really effective, right? The myths that we have talked about here today are still really persuasive for a lot of people. And we have to break those barriers down and make people understand why that is not the case. And, you know, the path forward, you know, as we all know, there are plenty of options. You know, our ideal is that, you know, we get the legislature to do their job and make this happen. You know, again, rent control, the bill that we're talking about is local option. Nobody is trying to implement rent control across the state. No one's trying to implement a single policy. We're simply saying, let's give the municipalities that want this the opportunity to do it. You know, we're told time and time again that, you know, what works in one place doesn't work in another, right? Especially when we're trying to force, you know, some of these housing programs to build affordability. We're told that we can't require affordability across the board because what works in Boston isn't going to work in Western Mass or the North Shore. But then we try to flip it around and say, cool, well, then give us the opportunity to protect our tenants. And people say, well, I don't know about that. I don't know if I like this policy. And so, you know, the path forward really has to start with building a real statewide coalition and a real statewide organizing arm behind, you know, getting people on board with rent control.
Yeah. So I want to turn back to Mark. You focused on the urgency of having protections against the rising tide of evictions. And so let's talk short of a rent stabilization statute. What are some of the things that we need to stop the tide of evictions and protect people in maintaining their present tenancies? And Kim, maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the things you're seeing, and also if there are areas where we need new laws or new statutory protections.
Go ahead, Kim. You can go first.
All right. Really quick, what I can say is, I know, Mark, I believe you touched on the no fault evictions. And if I'm wrong, my apologies. But with no fault evictions, there's really not there's not a lot of meat to work with to be able to preserve the tenancy. And so I'm really not a fan. I understand why some of the smaller landlords are moving in that direction because of the high amount of court costs and legal fees. But frankly, if folks would utilize the services that are available, the mediation services, for instance, can really be helpful. Educate folks a little bit better around the financial assistance programs. On a statewide level, yeah, we need to take a look at the RAFT program. That's the rental assistance for families in transition. So it can be helpful, but it also can be very, it can take an extreme amount of time from start to finish, and that's where landlords start to get frustrated. So those are just a couple of the points that I could make on that. One thing that I do want to jump on, Mark, I believe that when you were talking about rent control, one of the myths was that lowering the rents, having rent control would create loss of money for the landlords, and so then they're out of luck, and then they'll lose their properties, etc. And I really have to say, yeah, what a myth, because what happens when you are renting to folks who can't afford the apartment? They're going to try to pay the rent. They can't pay the rent. So then you're increasing the rate of evictions. Then you're increasing the landlord's obligation to court costs, sheriff's fees, lawyer fees. I don't understand how they can make that. They could even start to make that case when the much simpler solution is to prevent this in the first place.
So are there specific things we should be changing statutorily that would help protect against evictions?
I've got a few ideas.
Yeah, please.
Right, first and foremost, access to counsel is really important. Some 95 to 98% of tenants in housing court are unrepresented. Meanwhile, about that same percentage of landlords are represented by an attorney. And I can tell you for a fact, as an attorney who spends time in housing court, the tremendous difference that legal representation makes for pro se litigants. And so I think access to counsel is a huge piece of this puzzle that we really have to talk about. I think a couple other pieces that I'm just going to kind of rattle off and not go into too much detail because we don't have a whole lot of time. But Kim is right. There needs to be major reforms to the RAFT program, the rental assistance. The most recent budget came down and limits RAFT to $7,000 a year. If you're in Boston, that doesn't even cover moving costs.
Mark, explain a little bit what RAFT is.
Yeah, so RAFT is the statewide rental assistance program. And so for people that are struggling to pay rent, or at this point have missed rent, which is now a requirement, it's a fund, right? And so people that qualify for RAFT can get up to $7,000 a year to help pay rental arrearages, which sounds really nice. But again, in Boston, if you're a family in a 2 or 3 bedroom apartment in Boston, that's maybe a couple months rent. Right, that's really not going to help you. And there are also some other really onerous requirements on RAFT. Like they've re-implemented this requirement that you have a notice to quit before you can apply for RAFT. Right, which, as Kim said, RAFT is already a really long process. And so waiting for people to have that notice to quit on their door really increases the chances that people are going to be evicted. Right, and what we know, based off of years of experience and just pure numbers, it is a lot cheaper to keep people in their house than it is to rehome them or to house them in a shelter. And so we really do save money by making access to RAFT faster, easier, and with a lot more money. And so RAFT is a big part of that. More vouchers, right? More vouchers are a really big part of that. One of my colleagues at MLRI does a whole lot of work on increasing the supply of public housing. That's another big piece of that, to make sure that people are in housing that they can afford. Right, I mentioned access to counsel, I think. Another one that I want to quickly mention is the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, otherwise known as the right of first refusal. As Denise mentioned, there's this really big problem of people selling their apartment buildings to these really large corporate interests that then just come in, clear people out, jack up the rent. Tenant Opportunity to Purchase would give tenant associations the opportunity to purchase their property when their landlord decided to sell. Of course, that's a program that has to be funded by the state. Most tenants don't have enough money laying around to buy their building.
But
right,
there's
it's an
promise there. And I think
Yes.
the thing of it is there's promise there. There's a story in Boston that sort of really that
Absolutely.
approaches.
Yeah. There's a story out of East Boston recently, right, which is really quite literally the model that we're talking about in creating what's known as limited equity co-ops with the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. And then the last thing that I'll mention, we've spent a lot of time talking about renters, which makes sense. I think they are the most vulnerable. I am a renter, so that's who I tend to think about the most. But another bill that the Homes for All Coalition is pushing is a foreclosure prevention program bill, which would be mandatory mediation. So it doesn't create any new programs. All that it does is require that before a lender can foreclose on someone's home, they have to sit down at the table and explore alternatives to foreclosure, whether that be other monetary assistance programs, whether that be forbearances, whether it be restructuring, right? It could be any number of things. It just requires lenders to sit down and engage in an interactive process so we can try to keep people in their homes. Because like we said, renters, I think are, kind of the acute part of this crisis, but homeowners are really feeling it too all over the state. Like I said, I'm from Western Mass. There are large parts of Western Mass that never even recovered from the 2008 housing crisis, right? And are still dealing with the fallout from that. And so it is important for us, especially at Homes for All, to not leave out the small homeowners as a part of this, because whether you own or you rent, you should be able to stay in your home. Right? We don't want anybody displaced. And sorry, that was a lot, but
No, there is a lot, and one of the things that is a continuing challenge for people like me, and I think a lot of the other people who are in the audience today, is housing is such a complicated set of issues that getting a hold on it is really, really a challenge, and it's a little overwhelming at times. Let me ask this. Again, with the focus on how we keep people currently housed before we've been able to expand the housing stock, if we were going to throw a few $100 million of state money into improving the situation, where should we be throwing it? What would be the most important things to be spending money on? And that's a question I'd love to hear all three of you comment on. So, Denise, do you want to go first?
Peter, I want to pick up on something that Mark said. From our vantage point, he used the word that renters as a sort of an acute nexus of the issue. If we have some, if we can create the conditions through policy, I mean, the combination of things, it is complex, where renters are not rent burdened. That's an issue. And there's statistics that said that, and rent burden means that you pay 30 to 50% for moderately or more than 50% of your income on housing. So the difference is those individuals who are rent burdened have the opportunity, on average, have $10 in savings. We're talking about needing to, what's possible for someone with only $10 in savings. The route out for like home ownership or anything is really is acute. So if all of the renters in Boston were paying 30 to 40% of their income, they would have roughly $9,300. They'd be able to save $9,300. And that creates the opportunity for what, you know, for other, to put your kid in school, to do those other things. So that's what we, whatever they are, that's what we need to tackle. Because if we don't, the market and the conditions will continue to reap more and more vulnerable people. We just push more and more of our citizens into precarity.
I can't help but noting. I mean, I'm so glad you said that, because it is at the very heart of this whole issue, that the housing issue is really an economic justice issue as much as anything else. And at least to my mind, you know, I can't help but thinking that one way to solve the problem would be to make sure that everyone had an income that allowed them to pay what it costs to provide housing. That's a different way of thinking about this. It's not something that is about to happen overnight, but to think, oh, really, this is just a problem that housing is unaffordable is missing the fact that the real problem is that incomes and wealth are so unevenly distributed in ways that create those problems for people. I don't want to distract from the focus, but that does seem like it's a lot of the story.
For us, I mean, in our work, I mean, that is the story. It's the system, baby. You know?
Yeah. So one place that money is needed is to provide people with the ability to pay the rents. Are there other places that the money, that we should be pumping money in the near term? Kim?
Yeah. Well, if I had my way, we'd be looking at services, providing services to folks so that we're in a position to be able to get information to them. What we find in our roles and, you know, at Berkshire County Regional is so many folks don't know that they have rights. So, you know, we have a program where landlords and tenants can call and learn about their rights and responsibilities. If tenants don't know that there's a service available to help them with this, a landlord comes up and says, hey, you know what? I want you out. You have to be out of here by the end of the month, or gives them a letter that says you have to be out of here by the end, you know, by the 30th of September. They're going to think that because the landlord owns the building, that's, you know, his word is law and they have to go. And that happens so many times, and that puts them in a really precarious situation, because they pack up and they leave, and now they're not eligible for a lot of services. If they walk away from their apartment, they're not eligible for emergency assistance for families or the home base program. So we have to get the word out there. The only one who can tell you you have to leave your home is a judge. And, you know, while going into court is really frightening for a lot of folks, it's important that they know that. Also, I can't agree enough. We have to put money into affordable housing. We need vouchers. We need Section 8 vouchers. You know, and yes, as I said before, we need to rehab what we already have. We have a stock of housing. Rehab it, repurpose it, so that folks have a place to live. I can tell you in Pittsfield, I could name you the properties that are vacant, that are boarded up. Eventually it'll be torn down, which should never have had to happen. But yet, if you look out in back of those properties, you're going to see 6 or 10 tents, because folks can't live inside the building, but they're tenting outside the building because they're homeless.
So we're down, we just have a couple more minutes. And I do want to end with a little bit about what the ask ought to be. But before we get to that, just a quick top discussion, what about the problems of emergency shelters and emergency assistance for when people do fall through the cracks? Are there things we need to be doing about that right now? I don't know who's best to answer that. Kim, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in and just say, if we're looking at emergency assistance, and I think Mark probably is going to be really better capable of putting a bigger focus on this, but the bottom line is, when we're looking at emergency assistance to families, let's let it be what it is, emergency assistance, because the way the system is set up right now, folks will apply for emergency assistance. They have to be homeless, but yet the process takes so long. I've seen this process take weeks. So what are we doing? We're looking at keeping folks in their car, and you have to be a family. So an individual is not eligible for EA in Massachusetts. However, if you're a family, you don't want your children living in a car with you. So now you start to put them in, somebody else's home so they can live with relatives, because now you're worried about DCF coming in and taking your children. I mean, the cycle that this creates is horrific. When all, it's just, it's simple. I don't understand why it became such a complicated event. Someone's homeless, prove that they're homeless, and let them have some sort of shelter over their heads so we can keep these families intact.
So, boy, again, there is so much more we can and should be discussing. We are running out of time. We try to end each of these forums with a concrete ask. And I'll be frank, on the housing one, we're going to try and get to very concrete asks when we've gone through the whole series of forums. For the moment, I think the ask is, we need to just raise the temperature on this issue. And so we would ask everyone to reach out to your legislators and to the governor's office, and simply to say, this is the central issue. It needs to be addressed now, and it needs to be addressed in a massive way. The governor is about to file her bond bill, which will apparently include a bunch of measures to address some of the pieces of this problem. We need to make sure the legislature moves aggressively on that. Right now, let's just try and turn up the heat and make sure that our legislators recognize that they have to address this now. I want to thank Denise and Kim and Mark for joining us for this, and for providing really helpful insight, and also for giving us some sense of the wonderful work that is being done, even in the incredibly difficult circumstances we find ourselves in. And I think we're all grateful to the work all of you do, and to you for sharing your insights with us. So thank you all for being here. Do join us for the remainder of this series, and do reach out to your legislators, please.
Thank you. And keep track of the goings on at Homes for All Mass. And I think, Peter, you all have provided the information.
Yes.
Thank you so much.